Today, we bring you the raw and brutal story of Hans Kindle, a 19-year-old soldier from the 12th SS. Thrown into the hell of Normandy, he faced fire, chaos, and death head-on. This is his account, told with a touch of my own to deepen the immersion. A story of fire, desperation, and ruthless combat on the Western Front. We lost Puteaux on the 8th of June. That evening, as the sun started to fall, the 9th Canadian Brigade was ordered to take the village back. Their assault was set for 8:30 p.m. They came at us with tanks, machine guns, mortars, and heavy artillery. I will never forget that barrage. 48 field guns from their division, and even more from their Army Group reserves. The earth didn't just shake, it felt like it was trying to tear apart beneath us. Our battalion had already been worn down by the earlier fighting. We had taken heavy losses trying to hold the village. Then the British tanks, the 24th Lancers, hit us hard. Now, under this second attack, and with the terrifying weight of their bombardment falling all around us, we had to pull back. We fell back to the railway line, holding there as best we could. The order came shortly after. We were told to move back another 200 yards and dig in again. By then, the Canadians had dug in solid along the railway. The line they held was known as Line Oak. Our own attack earlier that day, launched by the 26th Panzer Grenadiers, had done little to shift them. There was no coordination with the Panzer Lehr Division, and the whole effort had been disorganized. We had hoped it would open the way to the coast. Instead, the British 8th Armoured Brigade had only moved 3 miles, just to the northern edge of a village called Audrieux. Still, even that small advance was a problem for us. That night, our division commander refused to back down. He ordered a new attack, this time at night. A special combat group was formed from different parts of the division. At the center were 2 companies of Panther tanks under a commander named Jurgensen. These tanks came from the 1st Battalion of the 12th SS Panzer Regiment. A reconnaissance company from the 25th Panzer Grenadiers would support us. Colonel Kurt Meyer, a well-known leader in our ranks, was chosen to lead the entire operation. Earlier that afternoon, Meyer had driven around our section of the front lines with the division commander. They had been chased by low-flying enemy aircraft the entire time. Somehow they both made it back safely. Meyer came straight to the command post. That was when he received his new orders, to relieve the pressure on the front by launching an assault on the village of Bretteville-l'Orgueilleuse from the east. The goal was to support another commander, Moncke, and help clear the way for his advance. The plan was clear. First, we would attack 2 smaller villages nearby, Rots and La Villeneuve, both held by Canadian troops. Once those were cleared, we would launch a fast assault toward Bretteville along the Caen to Bayeux road. Meyer had used this kind of surprise attack before on the Eastern Front. There, speed and shock had been the key to success. He also arranged for our infantry to move in from the south, crossing the railway and heading straight into Bretteville. We began the attack with about 90 minutes of daylight left. The 2 tank companies moved forward on either side of the road. The commander of the 12th SS Panzer Regiment, Max Wünsche, led the group in his Panther tank. I remember looking over and seeing the young men of the 15th Reconnaissance Company sitting on top of the tanks, riding on the engine decks. The rest of their company followed behind on motorcycles and sidecars, riding in the center of the road. It was their first real battle. For many of them, it would be the last. Colonel Meyer had once made a promise to these young men that he would ride into battle with them when their time came, and that evening he kept his word. His close friend and longtime messenger, Helmut Belke, pulled up on a motorcycle with a sidecar. In the sidecar was a military doctor. Meyer climbed onto the back seat and pointed forward. The tanks were already rumbling down the road. The soldiers sitting on top waved to him and he nodded back. There were no long speeches, just a look, just a signal, and then we moved out. To our right, I saw Commander Wünsche in his Panther. He had been fighting beside Meyer since the early days of the war. They knew each other well. They didn't need to speak. One glance between them was enough. And then, the entire group began to advance toward Bretteville. As we moved forward, I could feel the tension, the sound of the engines, the weight of the mission ahead, the fear, the hope. It all hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. We were not just launching another attack. We were stepping into something bigger. Normandy was becoming something else. It was no longer just a region on a map. It was a place of fire and steel, a place where men would either become legends or be buried without names. We moved out from the forming up point just before dark. I remember passing an 88mm gun battery and riding through the outposts of our own regiment. The road ahead looked clear, no barricades, no obstacles, so our tank drivers pressed forward hard. The engine noise became our loudest weapon. The roar of the Panthers echoed through the trees. My motorcycle unit and the artillery forward observer were following just a few hundred meters behind me. I could barely see the outlines of the tanks in front of us, just black shadows moving fast. My goal was to get through the village of Rotz before night fully set in. That was the plan I had made earlier with Commander Max Wunsch. The Panthers were moving in a wedge formation as we approached Rotz. Once we reached the edge of the village, the tanks came to a halt and positioned themselves to cover the entry. Our reconnaissance soldiers dismounted and swept ahead on foot. There were no Canadians left in the village. They had already pulled back to a nearby farm north of the railway line. I had hoped for surprise, but it was gone. They had likely seen our tanks earlier in the day as we scouted the roads. Without that element, the whole character of the battle was already shifting. One of our companies from the 26th Panzer Grenadier Regiment had already cleared a nearby area called Le Villeneuve and pushed into the northern edge of Rotz. They were digging in when we passed through, but the rest of the battalion, which had tried to move against Cardenville and Norry, ran into a wall. The Canadian Regina rifles stopped them cold, as their war diary later confirmed. That failure would prove to be a major setback in our effort to take the larger village of Bretteville. We pushed forward quickly. The recon soldiers cleared through both Le Bourg and Le Villeneuve, and we found the bridge over the Meuse stream still standing. The Panthers moved through the narrow village streets in single file, following behind the infantry. As soon as we passed the last buildings, we reformed the wedge formation. 2 tanks rushed down the main road toward Bretteville. The rest of us advanced alongside the road in darkness. All I could see ahead were glowing exhaust pipes, burning red in the night. Some of the Canadian defenders on the eastern edge of Bretteville were hit by our soldiers and Panthers, but inside the village itself, the Canadians had dug in well. They weren't running. I tried to keep up with the lead tanks. I was riding just behind the 2nd Panther when the road started to feel too exposed. I moved off to the right, making my way forward through a ditch. That was when I tripped. My foot struck a Canadian corpse. Just ahead, a small armoured vehicle was burning along the road embankment. We kept moving. I heard groaning and saw a wounded soldier lying off to the left. Machine gun fire ripped through the darkness ahead. More Panthers with grenadiers on top of them were pushing into the town under heavy fire. Our casualties were rising fast. My old friend and motorcycle driver Helmut Belker was hit. So was the commander of our reconnaissance company. I tried to mount my motorcycle to catch up with the assault, but a shell tore into the fuel tank. Flames exploded around me. I would have burned alive if not for the quick hands of a few nearby soldiers who managed to beat the fire out before it took hold. Between Le Bourg and Bretteville, the enemy opened up with anti-tank and machine gun fire from 6 tracked vehicles. The grenadiers dismounted and advanced on foot under that storm. The rest of the company kept pressing forward toward the village, but the resistance only grew stronger. Canadian tanks, anti-tank guns and more machine gun teams were waiting on the outskirts. I was still riding, following the main road into Bretteville. Norry was behind us now, just off to the left. I knew we would hit Canadian positions any second. The village was only a few hundred meters ahead. To help the lead Panthers push into the town, the rest of the 4th Company opened up. They fired explosive shells and blasted away with their machine guns, trying to suppress the defenders, but it wasn't enough. At least 4 Canadian anti-tank guns were waiting at the village edge. We got into a heavy firefight almost immediately. One of our soldiers, his name was Kesper, wrote about what happened next. His company moved up along the main road, tanks staggered one after another. He was on the right side, walking just off the road. He remembered seeing a church up ahead. They came under intense anti-tank fire. Some houses were already in flames. His commander, Pfeiffer, shouted out, "Set the houses on fire so we can see what we're shooting at." The tank in front of him was hit square in the centre. The battlefield lit up under parachute flares. Commander Pfeiffer was in the 3rd Panther. When it was hit, it burst into flames instantly. The war diary later recorded that Panther 404 spotted a Sherman tank at the village entrance and knocked it out. Meanwhile, our 1st Company was circling to the south of Bretteville, trying to seal off the village and meet up with grenadier units. But but all they found were more anti-tank guns. One of the platoon commanders, a man named Teichert, recalled what happened to them. His commanding officer ordered him to move his platoon around the southern edge and enter from the west. Several buildings there were already burning. Teichert told his men to drive as fast as possible to avoid being silhouetted in front of the flames, but it wasn't fast enough. One of the tanks was hit in the engine and caught fire. The crew bailed out in seconds. Teichert's own tank was struck in the turret. His loader was badly wounded, and the electrical systems went down. Another tank to his left also took a hit, but kept moving. Using the radio from the still functioning vehicle, Teichert called back to his commander and received the order to pull out. He got his injured loader onto the rear deck of one of the tanks and retreated with the last 2 Panthers. He made sure his man got to a hospital, fixed his vehicle's electronics, and then reported back for orders. He was told to return to the south of the village and observe the situation. Back on the main road, I watched the assault unfold. The 2 lead Panthers fired shot after shot, clearing the street ahead before charging into the village at full speed. It was the kind of sudden attack we had used on the Eastern Front. But this was Normandy, and I had my doubts it would work here. Inside the village, both sides were in total chaos. Tank shells flashed, explosions blinded us, and no one could see clearly. The Panthers pushed to the crossroads in the centre of town. Canadian headquarters had already been overrun, but their infantry wasn't breaking. They fired from the shadows. Some even used handheld anti-tank weapons. The fighting wasn't quick. It dragged on for hours. We had reached the centre of the village. One of the lead Panthers had been knocked out. The command post of the Regina Rifles was taken. In many ways, our surprise had worked, but we couldn't hold the ground. The supporting grenadiers never arrived. Without them, we couldn't clear or secure the village. There were simply too few of us. As daylight approached, I made the hard decision to withdraw back to the higher ground east of Rotz. Commander Winscher came to the same conclusion. His Panthers were pulled back. One of the other officers, Chemnitz, described what happened as they returned. The road was narrow and raised, so he had to guide the tanks carefully. Just as they moved, a Canadian fired again. Commander Winscher took shrapnel to the head, only a light wound, but it shook everyone. One of Chemnitz's own men, Nerlich, was badly injured and placed in a sidecar for evacuation, but he didn't survive the trip. By the 9th of June, the chaos of our early counterattacks had started to fade. For us in the Hitler Youth Division, those next days marked a shift. The fierce charges we had rehearsed for months had failed to push the Allies back into the sea. Our commanders hadn't given up on striking back, but it was clear that for now we were digging in. The Western Front was not breaking. Even at the highest levels, they still believed in a coming blow. Our intelligence, fooled by the British deception operation, what they called Operation Fortitude, still convinced Hitler that another invasion was about to land in the Pas-de-Calais, farther north. A radio message recorded in our headquarters even quoted the Führer himself, saying he had reliable information of an enemy landing on the morning of the 10th. Orders were issued like we were preparing for something massive, but in truth, that landing would never come. For now, the attacks by our 21st Panzer Division and our own 12th SS Panzer Division were halted. But next to us, the elite Panzer Lehr Division continued pushing toward Bayeux. Our commander, Fritz Witt, was determined to secure ground that could be used for future offensives. On June 9th, an attack was ordered on the village of Norry. Our 3rd company of Panther tanks had arrived too late to take part in the fighting the night before. Now they were to be thrown into the assault. That morning, General Geyer von Schweppenberg came to our sector. He visited our Panzer Grenadier Regiment's command at the Abbey of Ardennes, where he met with Colonel Meyer. Based on what we had seen the night before, Meyer believed we had to eliminate the Canadian stronghold in Norry before we could make any real progress. Orders were given while we were stationed in Rotz, but our tank company commander, Captain Rudolf von Ribbentrop, had been injured in an air raid before the invasion even began. His arm was still in a sling. Since he couldn't lead, the company was temporarily handed over to a regular army officer, Captain Ludemann. We were to move forward with 12 Panthers and a platoon of about 20 infantry from 1st Company stationed nearby. Our attack would come from the east. To protect the right flank to the north of the railway, the 4th Company's Panthers were put in overwatch. On our left, the 1st Company would advance from the Mu Valley to provide fire support. Meanwhile, 2 companies of Panzer Grenadiers were to attack Norrie again from the south. We started moving at 12:30 p.m. At that time of day, enemy aircraft were usually at their lowest activity, one of the few things we could count on. Our H-hour, the official start time of the attack, was 2:40 p.m. Shortly before that, Commander Wünsche had returned from getting his head wound treated. Despite his injury, he drove Ribbentrop himself from Rotz to our assembly point, determined not to be left behind. We, the Panthers of 3rd Company, moved out from the east side of Rotz. We passed under the railway and turned west, rolling parallel to the tracks. We grouped behind the 15th Reconnaissance Company in a patch of dead ground out of sight from Norrie. Captain Ribbentrop passed word to Ludemann before the attack began. Cross the 1,000 yards of open ground quickly. Do not stop unless you absolutely have to fire. He was especially concerned about our right flank. We lined up, 2 panzer platoons in front, 1 in reserve. At first, everything went smoothly. We advanced using whatever little cover we could, hedgerows, folds in the terrain, even dips in the earth. But our infantry quickly fell behind. On foot, they simply couldn't keep up. According to our war diary, the 1st Panzer Company emerged just as planned to provide fire support. From behind a hill, they opened up with all guns toward the church tower in Norrie. They believed an enemy artillery observer was stationed there. They raced toward the village with full speed. Their barrage took out 2 anti-tank guns and several infantry positions. Or so we thought. One of those anti-tank guns had not been destroyed. A Canadian section sergeant returned to it and fired 3 shots with a new kind of high-velocity anti-tank round. All 3 missed. He didn't know the round didn't require leading the target. They travelled so fast you could aim directly. We were lucky. A few inches difference, and it would have been a different story. As we approached the outskirts of Norrie, we still hadn't come under anti-tank fire. The Canadians had placed a section of 6-pounder guns, but they were facing south. They were locked in a fight with the 1st Company. Ludemann then gave the order over the radio, turn left, head for the tree line near Norrie's chateau. That way we would strike the enemy from behind and present our thickest armour to their guns. One of our junior commanders, Sergeant Morowitz, later recalled, "We drove at full speed without stopping, but our luck was running out. Canadian tanks, Shermans and Sherman Fireflies with powerful 17-pounder guns had just returned from collecting replacements. They rolled into position near Bretteville at exactly the wrong moment for us. From their flanks, they spotted our Panthers and opened fire. I was one of their targets. At about 1,000 meters, I saw movement near the train station and slammed my hatch shut. Then, a loud explosion. Our tank jolted. A track was torn off and we stopped cold. I thought it was a mine, but then came the second hit. Flames poured into the crew compartment. We had been hit. The tank was burning. That was the lead platoon under Lieutenant Stagg. All 5 tanks were destroyed within minutes. The whole attack came to a halt just outside Norrie, in open fields, well within range of Canadian infantry and their portable anti-tank weapons. 4 minutes later, 2 more Panthers were knocked out. We had no support, no chance to regroup. Commander Wünsche and Captain Ribbentrop were powerless, forced to watch in frustration as our tanks burned in front of us. The survivors, just 5 Panthers, pulled back. During the evacuation of our wounded, most of whom suffered burns, one of our medics, Siegfried Goose, drove into the field on a motorcycle to retrieve casualties. He was cut down by machine gun fire. His place was taken by a Navy soldier, Biermann, who stepped in as both cook and medic. None of us knew the Canadian tanks had arrived by coincidence, but in the eyes of the officers, the failure of the attack fell on Captain Ludemann. He was blamed for the loss of 7 tanks and 30 men. Later, Hubert Meyer wrote bitterly that once again we had learned the hard way. Surprise attacks had no chance of success unless conditions were perfect. That evening, we fell back and started building defences. We took turns digging, some by day, some by night. We cut down crops in the dark to open our fields of fire. Telemines were buried at the edges of the fields and connected by wire to bunkers. At company headquarters, We dug a narrow trench on the far side of the manor house and blasted a hole through its foundation. We turned the coal cellar into our command post. The young soldiers thought our defences were finished, but we kept digging, carving out trenches that linked platoons together. Other cellars nearby were cleared to hold ammunition, supplies, even wounded. Some were used by artillery observers. Others became makeshift shelters for prisoners. The few Panthers left from our 3rd Company rumbled back through rots, blackened from fire but still running. The 4th Company stayed behind, supporting our 1st Company and the divisional escort troops guarding our exposed flank that stretched toward Bretteville. Meanwhile, on our right flank, the 25th Panzer Grenadiers had managed to hold on to their gains north of the Abbey of Ardennes. But pressure from the British 3rd Division was constant. They were not stopping. Their target was clear, the city of Caen. At Galmanche, our 2nd Battalion prepared its defences under constant artillery fire. One of our officers, Lieutenant Havermeister, described how we never had a moment's rest. Even as shells fell, we kept digging in, refusing to give the enemy any more ground. To stop me from pacing around and bothering everyone, my young soldiers decided to make my command post a bit more comfortable. They dragged some old mats down from the chateau and even found a fancy French chair. I think it was called a Louis something. It was covered in silk and completely out of place in that coal cellar. But I have to admit, it made for a strange sort of luxury among the dirt, the wires and the maps spread out across old crates. After we pushed back 2 reconnaissance patrols and fought off a small enemy attack, we were certain a larger assault was coming, but it didn't. Instead, we got a surprise visit from our regimental commander, Colonel Kurt Meyer. He arrived with a small group, quietly stepping down into our cellar headquarters. He looked around with a small smirk, clearly amused by the luxury chair. Still, he seemed pleased that we hadn't dug in too close to the buildings, a mistake that would have drawn enemy fire straight into the village. Elsewhere, things weren't so quiet. Our 1st Battalion, digging in around the village of Buron, was getting hammered. The artillery was so intense, one of the men said not even a mouse could have moved. Canadian patrols were constantly pushing up against them, testing their line. The men cut down the steel anti-glider poles, what we called Rommel's asparagus, and laid them across their trenches as overhead cover, trying to feel a little safer. With no dedicated anti-tank battalion available, the job fell to the 2nd Panzer Battalion. Their Mark IV tanks had to drive up under fire just to push back enemy armour. One day, we noticed a group of Canadian tanks moving toward camps just to our right. It was clear the attack wasn't meant for us. It was targeting our neighbouring unit. But it turned out the Canadians didn't realise our front line extended farther than they thought. I could see their commanders standing exposed, leading from open hatches. I ordered our anti-tank crews to hold fire until the moment was right. As soon as the enemy reached the perfect distance, I gave the signal. The gunners opened up with all 3 anti-tank guns, slamming into their flank. I shouted for our 1st platoon to join in, machine guns and marksmen, and we turned that field into chaos. Within minutes, 6 tanks were knocked out. The rest of them started zigzagging wildly, their commanders either dead or wounded. Only after the attack failed did the artillery fire begin, and it didn't even hit us at first. It struck our battalion. But in the confusion, we managed to pull our guns back into cover. By the time the barrage reached our position, we were already dug in. We only took 3 light injuries, and by morning we saw the field had been cleared. The Canadians had towed their destroyed tanks away under the cover of darkness. One of our mortarmen, a soldier named Decker from 8th Company, told me a story I never forgot. He said that during the early days, just after the landings, the Allied warships off the coast had started firing on our positions. Their shells were massive. The whole ground shook with each impact. Decker had stepped away to relieve himself in the woods when the shelling started. He dropped flat to the ground, and a splinter from one of the blasts flew straight between the fingers of his left hand, red hot and razor sharp. It didn't touch him, not even a scratch. He told me laughing that he hadn't needed a laxative that day. Elsewhere, things were shifting. The 26th Panzer Grenadiers were under increasing pressure, but compared to their situation, our sector was quiet, for now. Still, from our position in 7th Company, we could see Canadian tanks forming up near Cambs. We barely had time to react when 10 of them rolled out of the woods. I was so stunned I didn't even notice their movement was angled away at first. That momentary hesitation could have cost us. By the afternoon of June 9th, the British 8th Armoured Brigade had begun to push slowly south from Audrieu toward Tilly-sur-Seulles, right through Panzer Lehr's sector. The link between our reconnaissance battalion and Panzer Lehr's grenadiers to the west was fragile. To reinforce this exposed flank, the final company of Panthers to arrive, the 2nd Panzer Company, was sent into the gap. They set up positions in the wooded area of the Parc de Boislande between Christaux and Fontenay. Our entire division was now dangerously spread out, holding a front line nearly 12 miles wide, from north of Caen all the way down to Bruay and Fontenay. The countryside here was nothing like the open fields around Caen. This was hedgerow country, the bocage, tight fields, thick brush, hidden danger. For us in the reconnaissance battalion and for the 2nd Panzer Company, it became a game of cat and mouse. We hunted and were hunted by British tanks, by infantry, by fighter bombers waiting to strike the moment we moved. Artillery fire crashed into anything that looked like cover. It wasn't random. It was part of a bigger plan. The British 7th Armoured Division was trying to push toward Villers-Bocage with the goal of surrounding Caen from the south. Even though their main thrust was on the other side of the river, our losses grew quickly. The reconnaissance companies were cut down to half strength. Our battalion commander, Major Bremer, was wounded in the fighting. Captain von Reisenstein took over in his place. In the areas between the railway line and the town of Audrieu, patrols from our 26th Panzer Grenadiers launched raids that disrupted the British advance. One British unit recorded being attacked from the rear as they tried to move south toward point 103. The situation became so serious that our overall commander, Fritz Witt, ordered a nighttime redeployment. During the night of June 9th, the 1st and 3rd Panzer Companies, along with our battalion headquarters, were moved to Fontenay. The 4th Company stayed behind to hold Rotz. According to our diary, we were in position by 5 a.m. on the 10th. The 2nd Company stayed hidden in the woods near the Parc de Boislande. The 1st and 3rd Companies set up north of the road to Caen. The 4th Company damaged a Churchill tank, hitting its turret. We saw wounded men being pulled out before the tank was towed away. Our total losses that day were 3 trucks, but enemy aircraft were relentless. Bombers, fighter bombers and artillery were everywhere. That same morning a final attempt was made to take Norry. The only fully intact unit we had left, our 12th Panzer Pioneer Battalion, was given the task. At 5 a.m. they began their approach, moving quietly through the Meuse Valley behind the 25th Panzer Grenadiers. There was no artillery to open the attack. It was meant to be stealthy. But as dawn broke behind them, the Canadians spotted the movement and unleashed a heavy bombardment of artillery and mortars. The pioneers sprinted forward under fire. Only the 1st Pioneer Company managed to get close. They used a sunken road to reach within 100 yards of the enemy. But there, machine gun fire pinned them down. They were outgunned. The Allies had seemingly endless ammunition. When the shelling died down, Lieutenant Toll ordered his men to charge. But the result was a disaster. The Canadians unleashed another storm of bullets. Every officer and sergeant was lost. The survivors fell back into the valley. By 10 a.m. they had withdrawn completely. 28 killed, 42 wounded, 10 missing. From that moment on, we realized the truth. We weren't going to be used for any grand counterattack. Hitler's orders had changed everything. We were now to hold the Allied beachhead in place. Contain them, that was it. Weeks would pass before the illusion of another landing in the Pas-de-Calais finally faded, and by then the 15th Army, the very force meant to strike back, would still be marching toward Normandy on foot at night, too late to matter. By June 10th, the Allies had taken the initiative. The British 7th Armoured Division moved into place to strike south of Bayeux. The 51st Highland Division was now east of the River Orne. Their commander, General Montgomery, planned to surround Caen completely. Alongside that main effort, he ordered attacks up and down the front, not just to support the advance, but to keep our forces unbalanced, unable to regroup or reinforce. They even believed we were still planning a counterattack, so they kept pressing, and we kept bleeding. It never made sense to me at the time. why the enemy kept pushing toward Caen when there was a wide open gap just south of Bayeux. If they had simply driven through that gap, they might have broken our entire front, but we began to understand why. That sector marked the dividing line between the British and American forces. Like so often in war, the coordination between allies wasn't as seamless as it appeared on maps. The two forces weren't overlapping in the field, not really. That so-called line of contact was just a drawn illusion. If the British 7th Armoured Division had swept westward and exploited what we now call the Caumont Gap, they might have changed the entire course of the battle, but they didn't. Then, just as our commanders were preparing for another counterattack, disaster struck. On the evening of June 10th, the headquarters of Panzer Group West, the very nerve centre for planning our armoured operations, was destroyed in an airstrike. The enemy had intercepted one of our Enigma-coded transmissions early that morning. Their codebreakers at Bletchley Park deciphered it quickly and sent the coordinates to their Air Force. That same day, rocket-firing Typhoon fighter bombers of the Royal Air Force struck Chateau Lacaine, followed by a wave of medium bombers. It was devastating. General Geyer von Schweppenberg, our top armoured commander in the West, was wounded. Our plans for the long-delayed counter-offensive, once again, were cancelled. Among the dead was one of our own, Wilhelm Beck, our division's liaison officer with Panzer Group West, a veteran and Knight's Cross recipient. His loss hit hard, but worse was what came after. A new order came from Berlin. It was clear. No withdrawal, no tactical fallback, no regrouping. Hitler had decided that every man would fight and die where he stood, and so the orders came down the chain and reached us. But switching from attack to defence was easier said than done. We were caught in transition. Enemy air power ruled the skies, and our movement had been thrown off from the start. The terrain was rough and we lacked everything: mines, wire, close combat weapons like Panzerfausts and grenades, even basic tools like shovels. Our engineer units had only the equipment they had marched in with, and even that was incomplete due to vehicles being destroyed by air raids. Enemy planes flew overhead almost all day. Only during lunchtime, between noon and 2, could you count on a break, so our supply columns had to move at night, and they were fast, sometimes too fast. Serious accidents happened regularly as trucks sped through darkness, headlights off to avoid detection. Ammunition and equipment had to come from across the Rhine, and time was always against us. Then came the 11th of June. That afternoon our division came under 4 separate attacks. The 3rd Canadian Division hit both sides of the Meuse Valley, trying to break our grip on the high ground near Rots. At the same time, the 7th Canadian Brigade launched an assault on Norry and Puteaux, hoping to push us off the high ground south of Choux. And on our left flank, the British 50th Division attacked our reconnaissance battalion near Point 103. It was a coordinated effort, one that stretched our line thin. But we had some luck. Earlier, one of our signals teams had intercepted Canadian radio messages. During a previous engagement near Bure, we had captured a knocked-out carrier and recovered maps and communication codes. Thanks to those documents, we could understand their radio traffic, even though their maps used fake names like Orinoco instead of Orne. They had printed these before the invasion to hide their intentions, but they kept using them after landing, and that gave us an advantage. With this information, our men dug in deep, even using borrowed tools. The Normandy soil was tough, rocky, but we worked through the night. Trenches, communication lines, bunkers, it all came together under pressure. Around midday on June 11th, our radio intercept teams caught another spike in activity. Canadian tanks and infantry were forming up for an attack on Le Mesnil-Patry. Our artillery commander quickly arranged fire support. The Mark IV tanks from our 2nd Panzer Battalion, minus 1 company, were brought across to reinforce. At 1 p.m. we saw Canadian forces leaving Bretteville, crossing the railway line and entering Norry. They were spotted immediately and hit with mortars and artillery. Their schedule fell apart. Their H-hour was pushed back to 2:20 p.m. We were waiting for them. Captain Siegel, commander of our 8th Panzer Company, was already in position. He gave the order. The hatches of our Panthers slammed shut, gun barrels lowered, shells were loaded as we moved. When the Canadian Shermans crossed the line and spread into formation, we hit them. Mortar and machine gun fire tore into the lead tanks. Their infantry, who had been riding on the tanks, jumped off and scattered. The Shermans kept going. They drove right over some of our forward positions. But we weren't beaten. Our 12th Panzer Pioneer Battalion was dug into the standing crops between Le Mesnil-Patry and Saint-Monvieux. Their camouflage was excellent. The Canadian tanks couldn't see them. The 1st Squadron rolled right past. Their infantry followed, trying to clear our overrun positions. One of our pioneers, a soldier named Horst Lütgens, was dug in near battalion headquarters. He told me what happened in his own words. I crawled back into my foxhole and grabbed the 1st Panzerfaust. I had 3 of them ready. Then I looked for a target. There it was, a Sherman tank. Massive, right in front of me. Its gun was firing towards our command post. I needed to get closer. I started crawling. Just then, Sergeant Mathony appeared and shouted, "Horst, watch yourself, I'll give you cover." That gave me strength. I wasn't alone in that nightmare. I kept crawling. Now there were more tanks. 5 of them, cutting through the gunpowder haze. I reached 20 meters, aimed and fired. Nothing. A jam. I recocked it and fired again. Another jam. My hands were shaking. One more try. Finally it launched. I couldn't even watch the impact. Another tank had spotted me and opened fire. I heard the explosion, then ran back in a zigzag and dove into my hole. Then something changed. The Canadians were turning around. I looked up and saw why. 3 of our Panthers had arrived. It was like watching a miracle. As the Panthers of the 8th Company advanced, they ran into the enemy just outside the village. Commander Siegel, in the lead tank, drove right into the middle of his own infantry. Shermans began to appear at close range. Too close. His voice came across the radio. "Enemy tanks, left side, 9 o'clock, 200 meters, fire!" And that was all we needed. Months of training kicked in. The tank lurched to the left, swinging into firing position. Before the ventilation system even kicked in, the gunner had fired. The first Sherman was hit instantly. Within moments, 4 more were burning. That day, we held our ground. Against a strong and determined Canadian assault, we stood firm and won. But we knew this was just the beginning. The enemy was learning, and so were we. As the battle raged on near Le Mesnil-Patry, our battalion commander, Major Prince, brought up the rest of our panzers. What followed was brutal. The 2 Canadian tank squadrons and their supporting infantry company were nearly wiped out. Our losses in manpower were just as heavy, but in terms of equipment, we lost only 3 Mark IV tanks. Meanwhile, over 30 Canadian tanks were left burning across the fields between Norry and Le Mesnil-Patry. But the truth was harsh. The Canadians had replacements, men and tanks. We didn't. Every soldier we lost was hard to replace. Every tank was irreplaceable in that moment. When I returned to our lines, I wasn't alone. A Canadian corporal had surrendered and came with me. As we reached the rear, we witnessed a scene I won't forget. Canadian ambulances rolled calmly onto the battlefield. Each one had a man riding on the side, waving a large Red Cross flag. Medics jumped out with stretchers, moving with urgency but not panic. For half an hour they gathered their wounded. No one fired a shot. It was like watching a peacetime rescue. Eerie, silent, surreal. But elsewhere on the front, the fighting didn't stop. While the Canadians hit Le Mesnil-Patry, the British 50th Division launched an attack further west. Their goal was to expand the narrow corridor that led to Point 103 and eventually push toward the town of Tilly-sur-Seulles. The attack fell on our reconnaissance battalion and the 3rd Battalion of the 26th Panzer Grenadiers. 2 British battalions advanced, one from the north side of the railway line and one from the south near Le Haut-d'Audrieux. That day, the hedgerow fighting turned chaotic. Neither side really knew who was where. We tried to cover our thin lines by patrolling aggressively, moving west toward Audrieux and Point 103, where the 8th British Armoured Brigade had gone over to the defensive. Later, the enemy would describe those patrols as full-scale attacks, lumping them in with Panzer Lehr's movements, but in truth, they were desperate actions to mask our weakness. By the afternoon of June 11th, British reconnaissance revealed what we feared. Their eastern flank was weak. So, they rushed the 6th Green Howards and 3 understrength tank squadrons to take the high ground at Point 102. There was no time to prepare. Their commander even protested, saying he had no reconnaissance and no fire plan. He was told simply, "Get on with it." They assumed we wouldn't be there in strength. The British historian from the 4th 7th Dragoon Guards later wrote how difficult it was to fight in the bocage. A tank could rarely see more than 400 yards, and when the defenders were determined, like we were, a single machine gunner and a few snipers could hold off a whole battalion, and that's exactly what we did. The British attack began at 2:30 p.m. with a single tank squadron up front, but almost immediately the infantry and tanks became separated. Our men stayed hidden until the Shermans passed. Then the machine guns opened up. Once the tanks were isolated, we went after them with anti-tank guns and Panzerfausts. Without a proper fire plan, the British couldn't deal with our 75mm guns. We picked them off one by one. 4 of our Panthers joined in, and by the end, 7 of the 9 Shermans were knocked out. The British infantry, meanwhile, was crawling forward through the hedgerows, trying to move up a sunken lane. Their historian later said they'd never encountered defenders like us in the 5 days since landing. They tried to outflank us, but we stopped them just a few hundred yards east of the main road. British officers were being picked off, and eventually they called off the attack. By nightfall, they pulled back. The 6th Green Howards lost 200 men, many captured. We lost 70. Another attack by the 7th Green Howards began at the same time. Their goal was to take the woods and the chateau south of WWII, our battalion headquarters, but they never made it. Before they even crossed the railway, our 11th Company opened fire. Then, as they moved into the kill zone of our 10th Company, the fire doubled. They were stopped cold before they had advanced 100 yards. Their company fell back across the tracks. The battalion retreated after dark. They lost 67 men, 27 dead. But we weren't winning everywhere. The real danger was our exposed position in the villages of Rotz and Le Hamel. For days, artillery had rained down. Then, on the morning of June 11th, Canadian infantry launched an assault. We stopped them, but that afternoon, enemy Shermans advanced from high ground near Rostel. Our Panthers from 4th Company opened fire, knocking out several. The rest turned back, for now. Then the commandos came. With support from tanks and covering fire, they broke into Le Hamel. Rotz came under heavy shelling again. I remember the moment clearly. Some of our men were pinned down in the ditches, explosions tearing the ground around them. Still, we returned fire. The commandos and Shermans entered the northern part of the village. Our 1st Company, already low on manpower, couldn't hold. But then our divisional escort company counterattacked. 2 sections of infantry with a platoon of Panthers launched a fierce push. They cleared the village, knocked out 6 Shermans and captured 40 prisoners. Still, the pressure was too much. Our troops were forced back again, withdrawing down the main street of Rotz. Orders were given to make a last stand at the village centre near the bridge. The enemy tried to outflank us through the fields. What followed was close quarters fighting. Panzer Grenadier against Commando, Panther against Sherman, grenades, rifles, knives. Some Shermans made it over the bridge and fought us in the narrow streets. Major Lee of 46 Commando later said that we were nothing like the troops they had met on the beaches. We were lightly equipped, well camouflaged, constantly changing position. He said we fought with fierce determination and almost never surrendered. I take no pride in it, but I know he was right. Eventually, our survivors from 1st Company and the escort troops fell back to La Villeneuve and Le Bourg. By dawn on June 12th, we had pulled out completely, regrouping at Francoville and south of the railway. The commandos had taken Rotz, the only Allied success against our division on that day. The next morning, a Canadian officer from the Chaudière Regiment walked into Rotz. His account said it all. They fought like lions on both sides, he wrote. The dead lay body to body, commandos and SS men side by side, grenades scattered in the streets, tanks crushed into each other, their gunners still hanging dead from their turrets. 1 commando and 1 German, locked together in death, killing each other at the same moment. That's the kind of battle it was. June 12th began more quietly for us. Our line held, but the Allies were shifting focus. Montgomery's plan to encircle Caen had been delayed by our resistance and by Panzerlehr's defence at Tilly-sur-Seulles, so the British 7th Armoured Division began to push west, into the Caumont Gap. We rushed everything we had to that sector. One unit was a company of 5 Tiger tanks from our heavy battalion. They had marched from Paris, and only 28 of the original 45 made it to Normandy. Then their hiding spot in the woods was discovered and bombed. 15 Tigers remained, and 5 of them, under Captain Michael Wittmann, would stop the British advance at Villa Bocage the next day. Even so, our daily routine in defence continued. Decker, one of our Panzer Grenadiers, later told me, J-Bows, the Allied fighter bombers, made it impossible to move during the day. We moved at night, almost every night. During the day you stayed hidden. One morning I was walking near the edge of a field. The sky was full of Allied planes. Even though I was alone, they spotted me and came after me. I ran into the woods. They fired at everything that moved. But even in the woods, we weren't safe. Artillery often fired into the trees, Decker said. The shells exploded above us, in the canopy. Shrapnel rained down. It was worse than out in the open sometimes. We dug deep and we stayed quiet. But they always seemed to know where we were. And so the fighting dragged on, day by day, hedge by hedge, house by house. Normandy was becoming a graveyard of steel and fire. The death of our commander, Fritz Witt, hit us like a thunderclap. It was early on the morning of June 14th. For once he wasn't out with the regiments, unusual for him. Our divisional headquarters was still located near Venoix, just outside Caen, tucked away behind the railway line in a large house surrounded by gardens and trees. The signal battalion had hidden their vehicles under the trees, and dugouts had been prepared behind the house for shelter in case of bombardment. That morning, I had been sent out to scout possible fallback positions. It was the first time I'd left headquarters since the invasion began. Then a radio message came through. Something had happened. They wouldn't say what, just told me to return immediately. My driver pushed the vehicle hard all the way back. I kept replaying worst-case scenarios in my head. When I arrived, I saw the damage. Naval artillery had bracketed the headquarters. Shells had crashed into the trees, tearing the place apart. The staff had rushed to the shelters. Witt had been the last to enter, always the last. That's when it happened. A shell exploded in the trees above, and shrapnel caught him in the head. He was killed instantly, gone, just like that. He was our father, not just the division's leader, but its soul. I reported the loss to SS Panzer Corps and immediately called for Kurt Panzermeier to take over command of the division. After that, the headquarters was moved west, into the valley of the river Odon near Verson. This time the radio company was set up further away and linked by cable. We feared enemy radio detection, and with good reason. Not long after, our radio intercept section picked up Allied chatter planning a strike on our 12th SS Panzer Regiment's command post at Rauray. Thanks to that warning, we cleared out non-essential men and vehicles in time. The bombing came, but the dug-in troops and tanks survived with only minor damage. Meanwhile, pressure was growing along our front. South of Point 103 and at Tilly-sur-Seulles, Panzer Lehr was slowly being pushed back. That exposed our western flank. Much of the 26th Panzer Grenadiers line was too close to the enemy to withstand a major assault. We decided to pull back to a new defensive line along the Fontenay-Saint-Marvieux road, just over 2 miles to the rear. This move would also let us reform the reconnaissance battalion as a reserve force. SS Panzer Corps finally gave the green light, despite Hitler's order not to surrender a single inch. Our 2nd Battalion's panzers stayed forward to cover the withdrawal. The Panthers were pulled back and gathered around our command post at Le Bas-des-Forges. Then, thanks again to our radio intercepts, we learned that the British believed Christaux was still in our hands. They were planning an attack. In truth, only a handful of snipers and observers remained in the village. So, we laid a trap. The usual Allied barrage thundered in, smashing empty ruins. Then their tanks and infantry advanced, cutting through the hedgerows. That's when our guns opened up. Mortars, artillery, machine guns. The fields became a death zone. The British patrols that followed up later found nothing but destruction and silence. The trap had worked. The British had failed once more to capture Caen. After the mauling of their 7th Armoured Division, General Montgomery had to pause. But bad weather arrived too. A fierce storm from the northeast between June 19th and 21st. It slowed their supply landings to just 20% of normal. It bought us time. The High Command had its own plans. Reinforcements were finally on the move. 2nd SS Panzer Corps was coming from Russia. The 1st SS Panzer Division, the Leibstandarte, was en route from Belgium. The 2nd SS, Das Reich, was crawling up from southern France. Infantry units from across Europe were marching toward Normandy. But with the Allied deception plan, Operation Fortitude, still working, few divisions from the Pas-de-Calais had been released, and the skies were still deadly. Fighter bombers attacked anything that moved. Supplies could only be moved at night. It was a race against time, and we all felt it. We continued to strengthen our lines. Around Fontenay, Sturmbannführer Siebken's battalion of the 26th Panzer Grenadiers held the area. The rest of the regiment dug in just north of the Fontenay-Saint-Malvieux road, lying in what remained of the crops. 5 companies of Panzer IVs, still doubling as our anti-tank force, dug in on a gentle ridge south of the road. Each panzer had alternative firing positions. Behind them, deep in the bocage, were 88mm guns from the 3rd Flak Corps, and farther back still, the Panthers of the 1st Battalion, 12th Panzer Regiment. We knew the enemy was coming. On June 17th, after securing Christaux, the British 49th Division attacked Parc de Boisland, a wooded orchard north of our lines. After a heavy barrage, they broke into the forward positions held by Siebken's battalion. At 1:30 in the afternoon, our grenadiers launched a counterattack. The 8th Panzer Company supported them from the southwest. An hour later, our 6th Company left its dug-in positions and joined in, reaching a position just behind the slope near Hill 102. We hit hard. The 6th Company knocked out 3 Shermans, a Churchill and 5 anti-tank guns. The 8th Company destroyed 2 more Shermans, but we couldn't take back the orchard. At 11:30 that night, both companies pulled back. Each had lost 1 tank, Panzer 645 and Panzer 816. It was a bitter, brutal fight. Siebken's forward company had only been forced out at a high cost to the British. Their artillery had done the damage. Our counterattack, though fierce, was broken up by their fire. Obersturmbannführer Monke refused to let the orchard remain in enemy hands. He ordered it retaken the next day by Olberter's battalion. At 12:35, our artillery pounded the orchard. Then, 2 armoured infantry companies, supported by the 6th and 8th Panzer Companies, attacked on foot. But even with all that firepower, we couldn't retake the woods.